Hello, everybody, and good morning, and welcome to the latest iteration of SCS's webinar series, Food and Agriculture Rising, Harness the Power of Independent Verification to Speak to Your Consumers. This episode is titled Choosing the Right On-Product Claims for Your Brand, Non-GMO Project, USDA Organic, and SCS Gluten-Free. And this is part of a series of webinars SCS is conducting throughout the year that covers many different areas and facets of the general space of certification for the food and agriculture industry. And there will be some more information at the end of this presentation on the next episode, and you can find more on scsglobalservices.com. My name is Ned Hallaby. I am the Director of Sales for the Product Claims vertical here at SCS that covers the Non-GMO Project, USDA Organic, and Gluten-Free programs. My co-host for today is Lucy Anderson, who is the Director of our Product Claims certification.
Good morning, everyone.
Great, and just before we get to the agenda, I have some housekeeping items that everyone should be aware of. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so you will not be able to join in verbally with this presentation, but we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation that will cover anything that you guys want to talk about. Please put the questions you have into the chat box, which should be part of your GoToWebinar interface, and we'll address them at the end of the show. If we don't get through all of those questions, we will be able to follow up with you after the show. My contact information will be available at the end of the presentation. You'll be able to reach me via phone, via email, and if there's anything we don't get to, just please don't hesitate to let me know afterwards. And we're recording this presentation, so you will be emailed a recorded copy after the show. For any reason you don't receive it, let us know, and we'll make sure you get a link. And if anyone can't attend on your team, please let us know, and we'll make sure they get it as well. And so the agenda for today, initially, I'm going to cover an introduction to SCS and some general information as it relates to the marketing growth and ROI of these important claims. Lucy will provide an overview of the standards, as well as the key differences between them, similarities, the audit processes, again, a broad overview, and the regulatory requirements. Then she's going to share some keys to success, some things that we find companies can take advantage of initially and during the audit process that will lead to better outcomes, faster certification, and an overall better program. And then we'll have the Q&A section, as I mentioned, so please put those questions into the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the show. So to provide some background of SCS, SCS can sort of most broadly be described as a certification body, but that really doesn't cover everything that we do. SCS is a global company with 38 years of experience, offering 30,000 certificates across dozens and dozens of programs in the food industry and far beyond. The sort of cross sections of services we offer is beyond certification is auditing, testing, standards development, life cycle assessments, training, and consulting. And so there are few ways we could not work with a company who is interested in building a sustainability program, assessing their own internal programs, and everything in between. So I'm confident we can meet your needs. SCS is organized into 3 general divisions, of which Lucy and I are in the Food and Agriculture division. And so this is just a small sampling of the services that we offer outside of the food and ag industry. Everything from indoor air quality to climate metrics, certifications for the metals, jewelry industry, building materials, forestry certifications, aquaculture certifications, carbon offset verification. The list goes on and on and on. And so I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about the food and agriculture specific programs that we work on. But it's important to know that SCS is far beyond a food and agriculture exclusive company. As I mentioned, these are some of the really important programs, but not all, of the food and agriculture division that we work in. Lucy and I are most closely related to the USDA Organic program, the Non-GMO Project, and SCS's proprietary gluten-free certification. But beyond that, we are a full-service food safety certification company. We are approved to offer various GFSI level food safety certifications, including SQF, BRCGS, Global GAP, Primus GFS. And beyond food safety certification, we also do a tremendous amount of food safety consulting to help companies prepare for these audits. We do a constant food safety training offerings for these schemes to help prepare the employees of these companies to fulfill the obligations of the food safety standards. We can do these trainings at your facility with your team exclusively. You can take these trainings individually online. There's a lot of different food safety training options you can find on our website. And then in the social space, SCS has a broad range of services that audit two key social sustainability metrics. Those are the SMETAs, Rainforest Alliance, Fairtrade USA. We do a tremendous amount of work with those important standards. We also do consulting and proprietary internal sustainability programs called responsible sourcing strategies. So larger companies that want to understand and evaluate and improve upon their internal sustainability programs, we offer customized solutions for that as well. So there's a lot of different ways in which SCS can work with companies of all sizes. So now I want to kind of transition to talk about each of these programs individually and the market trends and general importance within the food and ag industry that each represents. Starting with the Non-GMO Project, as you probably have noticed if you're in the natural food space, Non-GMO Project has experienced a tremendous amount of growth year over year. Here in just the past decade, we've seen sales of Non-GMO Project verified products go from 1.3 billion to 39 billion. So that's obviously a tremendous amount of growth and increased relevance in the natural food space. You're talking about 60,000 Non-GMO Project verified products currently amongst over 3,000 brands. So the growth has been tremendous. Lucy and I actually have been involved in managing the Non-GMO Project program here at SCS since SCS received its accreditation. So we have personally witnessed all of this growth, especially at SCS, and now at this point we've worked with hundreds of companies all over the world. So while this standard is designed for the North American food market, we have worked with companies on every continent. I think of within every industry within the food industry, brand owners, ingredient suppliers, finished goods, agricultural commodities, animal feed, pet feed. The list goes on and on. I'm struggling to think of a company that we haven't at least interacted with in some regard, exploring the Non-GMO Project program. And so we're very lucky and grateful to be involved with this program and witnessing such extreme growth. And the same is broadly true with the organic industry as well. This is a standard and a certification that is older and more mature. Organic has been around longer, but it's still experiencing incredible growth. And in 2020, U.S. organic sales increased by 12.4% to almost $62 billion. So it is a major force within the food industry. It transcends crops and agricultural producers and is in processing facilities and livestock and pretty much everything in between. So as you can see by these charts, we've seen a tremendous amount of growth across the board. So we at SCS we're also an organic certification body, and we also feel very lucky to be a part of that, and we've seen our organic program grow tremendously. And that's growers and that's processors and handlers and distributors now as well. So these are all standards that are more and more requested by consumers and by retailers, and you're seeing that in these metrics. Gluten-free certification is, as far as a concept, it's a little bit newer. The average consumer is far more aware of gluten-free, the benefits, the perils of ingesting gluten for certain people that have pre-existing conditions. And so the general level of growth is huge compared to what it was even 10 years ago. This is due to a variety of factors, but it's generally something that consumers are demanding more and more and are just becoming more and more aware of. So there's different reasons why people pursue gluten-free certification, but transparency and documented certification is becoming the norm now, more than something that was optional in the past. And this is most true in North America, as these kinds of as American consumers want gluten-free certified products. And to summarize, the general story is on-product labeling, product claims, as we call them, have experienced a huge rate of growth and are continuing in the future to become more relevant, to become more aware as far as at the consumer level. And this is, products aren't just becoming organic, they're becoming non-GMO certified as well. And the importance, especially for non-GMO and for gluten-free, is more and more based around third-party certification, meaning that self-declarations of non-GMO status, self-declarations of gluten-free status retailers are moving away from that model. They're tending to tell their suppliers, get the third-party certification. It reduces, liability at the retailer level. Consumers want to see that there is a third-party certificate to back up the claims for health reasons and for other reasons around transparency. And so certification is becoming the norm now. And at this point, I am going to transfer the presentation over to my colleague, Lucy, who will be able to take you through the overview of these standards and give you some key insights.
Great, thank you, Ned. As Ned briefly went over in the agenda, I'm going to go a little bit more into the technical nitty-gritty here, starting with a basic overview of the standards, diving into some differences and similarities, talking a little bit about eligibility for each of the three standards, what the certification process looks like, and wrapping up with some keys to success for each of the three. Okay, so starting with organic. So the organic standard is owned and maintained by the USDA. So it is a government-owned standard, and SCS is a third-party certification body for this standard. So we are accredited by the USDA to offer the organic standard. It really has a focus on biodiversity and focusing on biological and mechanical practices that foster the cycling and the sustainability of resources. So it prohibits the use of things like synthetic fertilizers, sewage sludge, irradiation, and GMOs. And we'll dive into this a little bit comparing the organic standard to the Non-GMO Project and kind of the differences there. And as I mentioned before, it has that kind of focus on physical and mechanical controls for pests, weeds, and diseases before, allowing any other substances to be applied. And certification starts from the ground up. So if you're eating an organic granola bar, that means that the oats used to produce that granola bar were certified, and every step of the supply chain along the way has been certified. So the oat milling facility has been certified, and then the granola bar manufacturing facility will be certified as well. Sorry, I'm a little bit trouble changing the slide here. There we go. Okay. So SCS offers 3 types of organic certifications. So we offer crops, so that would be to the farmers growing the crops, handlers, which are processors and non-processors. So an example of a processor would be a granola bar manufacturing facility, and a non-processor is a much simpler handling facility. So if you're not doing any mixing of ingredients or things like that, if you're kind of pack in, pack out, or an importer, for example, that would be considered a non-processor. And then we also offer private label certification, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but this would be for if you have a co-packing facility that produces all of your products, you can get certified as well as that kind of brand owner private label. Okay, going into Non-GMO Project, this standard is owned and maintained by the Non-GMO Project, which is a non-governmental nonprofit. So it really focuses heavily on the prevention of GMOs in the supply chain. And so sometimes people say, my finished good product has no GMOs, but really we're looking to make sure that the crops used to produce, or the materials used to produce that finished good product, have no GMOs. And a good example of this is looking at animal-derived products. People say, okay, well, my meat isn't genetically modified, but really what the Non-GMO Project is focusing on is the prevention of GMOs in the supply chain. So when we're looking at a Non-GMO Project verified meat product, we're actually looking at the feed provided to those animals to make sure that that corn and soy and alfalfa and whatever else is fed to them is not genetically modified. Things like fertility inputs, pest, weed, disease management are not in the scope of Non-GMO Project, unlike organic, but there is a focus on post-harvest testing of high-risk crops. So while organic requires that non-GMO seed is used, there is no finished good post-harvest testing on crops where that is the case for Non-GMO Project. Organic does have measures in place to prevent, cross-pollination and contamination and things like that, but there is no actual post-harvest testing required. Certification bodies do that on a spot testing basis sometimes, but it is not required for the participant by the standard. And unlike organic, Non-GMO Project verification is not required at every level in the supply chain. So if you are, for example, a granola bar producer, you can be Non-GMO Project verified, but your oat supplier does not necessarily have to be Non-GMO Project verified. So this is kind of what we can call a top-down certification in some ways, because it is not required that every step of the supply chain is certified. Oops. Okay, looking at the, I mentioned kind of high-risk crops before, but on the left here is a list of all of the crops that are considered high risk. There are some ingredients outside of crops, things like microorganisms, enzymes, algae, things like that can be considered high risk as well. But generally, these are the commercially available high risk crops here on the left. And so you might say, oh, great, my granola bar doesn't contain any, canola or corn. But really what we're looking at a lot of the times in these evaluation is derivatives of these crops. So things like ethanol. Ethanol is commonly derived from corn. Things like natural flavors oftentimes contain ancillary substances, things like ethanols, maltodextrins, other ingredients that may be derived from high-risk crops. I kind of used that meat example before. So you see meat, dairy, eggs, bee products, things like that are high risk. So really, these crops are used to produce many items in the supply chain, and we're going to be focusing on those. Citric acid is another really big one, ascorbic acid. These microbially derived ingredients, because they're usually fermented on carbohydrate substances, or substrates, excuse me, which oftentimes are derived from corn or sugar beets, which you might notice are listed as high-risk crops on the left. So it's not just looking to make sure that your granola bar does not contain any alfalfa or papaya. It's making sure that the derivatives of all of your ingredients, that that agricultural source, and if that is high risk, that's evaluated appropriately. Okay, and looking at the SCS Gluten-Free standard. So this is owned and maintained by SCS Global Services. There is a testing requirement for gluten on ingredients, finished good products, and equipment. Ingredients and equipment depends on the level of risk there, and the quantity or the frequency for finished good product testing does depend on the risk level there. There's a focus on facility policies to ensure that adequate systems are in place to prevent gluten contamination. And certification can also be done at any level. So if you are the granola bar certifier, you can get certified yourself. Also, if you are the private label, for example, or the brand owner, your manufacturer, you can be certified and will do the audit at your manufacturing facility. And this is very similar to the Non-GMO Project and different than organic. On-site audits are required if a facility handles any gluten or oats inside of the facility that are outside the scope of the certified products. So if you're also producing a different type of granola bar that contains wheat in it, for example, then your facility would be subject to an on-site inspection. We also do virtual inspections for operations that do not require the on-site inspections. And ingredients are sorted into 3 risk categories. So as I mentioned before, testing requirements for ingredients are based on risk. So we have 3 different risk levels for ingredients: low, medium, and high. And they really are based on the overlap with gluten-containing grains in the supply chain. So just because, you know, corn inherently does not contain gluten does not mean that there is no risk of overlap with gluten-containing grains and therefore gluten contamination in the supply chain. So that's kind of what we look at when we're ranking these 3 into risk levels. Okay, looking at some differences. It was a little bit difficult to put together a slide covering all the differences between the certifications because it's not necessarily apples to apples, but I kind of did some overview high-level points here. So as I mentioned before, organic is ground-up certification. So every step in the supply chain must be certified, unlike Non-GMO Project and gluten-free. So for gluten-free, you can have that kind of manufacturer level or brand owner level with co-packer participation, which is very similar to Non-GMO Project. It is a little bit more involved with gluten-free. We do have to sign an NDA with your manufacturing facility and do an audit with them, whereas Non-GMO Project tends to be a little bit more back and forth emails as opposed to a formalized multi-hour audit. If you're making a certified organic product, most of the ingredients are required to be certified organic in that granola bar. We'll use that as our example. So most of your ingredients, with very few exceptions, are required to be certified organic to be eligible for use in your product. So we're really just going kind of, when we're doing that ingredient review, we go one step back. We're going to look for the organic certificate from your oat supplier, the organic certificate from your maple syrup supplier, the organic certificate from your coconut supplier. For Non-GMO Project, because that certification is not required at every level, what we do is gather documentation from your suppliers, and once in a while we do have to go multiple steps up the supply chain to be able to make sure we get the adequate information to make sure that ingredients are not derived from high-risk inputs, and if they are, that there are preventative measures in place to ensure that these are not genetically modified high-risk ingredients. And with gluten-free, the testing, we do require testing for ingredients, again, based on their risk of overlap with gluten-containing grains in the supply chain. So I kind of went into this a little bit before, but for organic, there is a Non-GMO Project or Non-GMO declaration required from any non-organic ingredient suppliers, and the Non-GMO Project is going to be focusing on post-harvest testing of high-risk crops, but there isn't self-made non-GMO declarations usually don't suffice for Non-GMO Project auditing. In terms of audits, USDA requires an on-site inspection for every single operation. So if you are certified organic, there will be an on-site audit for your operation. Non-GMO Project is primarily desk audits. On-site inspections are required for a couple types of operations, but it's very, very few operations. We tend to see them most commonly at things like feed mills, but I won't go into the too specifically on that. And then gluten-free, every organization requires an inspection, but depending on the risk of the operation, that could be virtual or that could be on-site. And then a couple more differences between organic and Non-GMO Project. As I mentioned before, fertility inputs, pest, weed, and disease control inputs are all in scope for organic, but they are not in scope for the Non-GMO Project. And then organic does not require that post-harvest testing of high-risk crops or of crops. And then the Non-GMO Project does require that for high-risk crops. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So a couple quick similarities between the couple. All ingredients are going to be thoroughly reviewed for compliance and risk. Manufacturing facilities are always in scope, and there's a pretty big focus on contamination and segregation for all three of these certifications. And kind of diving into that a little bit more, they're all considered process-based certifications. So that means there's a really strong focus on the production systems and the inputs to ensure that the finished good product is meeting relevant criteria of the applicable standard. So for all three, we're going to be looking at standard operating procedures, sanitation standard operating procedures, record maintenance concerning the production and handling of the product. So we'll be thoroughly evaluating the systems in place that you have, as well as looking at records of implementation of these systems. Diving into the eligibility a little bit for each of the three, for USDA Organic, in order to work with SCS, operations must be located within the United States or Mexico. And if you are outside of there, you are eligible to work with SCS on organic if your products are sold in the US or repacked for export by a certified operation in the US only if the country of origin does not have an organic standard recognized as equivalent to USDA Organic. So Canada is an example of this. If your operation is located in Canada, they actually have an equivalency agreement with the US, so you will have to work with a certifier based in Canada or a certifier that has Canadian, that can certify to the Canadian COR. I won't go too nitty gritty into import-export right now, but there are equivalency agreements with some specific countries and blocks, including the EU, Japan, South Korea, and Canada. And so if your operation is in the United States, for example, there are these equivalency agreements. You can work with SCS to export your products that are certified USDA Organic to these countries. For Non-GMO Project, it's a little bit more straightforward. Verified products must be sold within the US, Canada, and or Mexico. And with explicit consent from the Non-GMO Project, sometimes products can be sold outside of these countries as well. But to be eligible, you must sell your product in the US, Canada, and or Mexico. Your operation can be located anywhere as long as you are selling into the US, Canada, and or Mexico. And just something to note is that the Non-GMO Project standard is not necessarily equivalent to other international non-GMO standards. So the EU regulations come to mind, and in many cases, the Non-GMO Project is actually more strict. So just something to note, if you have an existing non-GMO certification that is not the Non-GMO Project's, that won't necessarily mean that your ingredient is compliant or your systems are compliant, because they are not necessarily equivalent. And looking at gluten-free, most products produced and or sold in most countries are going to be eligible for certification. We're currently working with companies all over the world, selling into all different types of markets. And much like the Non-GMO Project, it is not necessarily equivalent to other gluten-free labeling standards out there or federal gluten-free labeling standards. So the US, Canada, and the EU are good examples of having these kind of federal requirements for self-made labeling claims for gluten-free. You have to have less than 20 parts per million of gluten in your finished good product. The SCS gluten-free standard and other rigorous gluten-free standards do require that your gluten content is lower than 10 parts per million. So this is different than many standards out there, as well as many federal gluten-free labeling requirements out there. And so something to note is there are a few countries, Australia and New Zealand come to mind, that have federal requirements for that gluten-free self-made labeling that are lower than 10 parts per million. So I believe theirs is 3 parts per million. So if you do sell into one of those countries, you will be responsible for having even less than 10 parts per million of gluten and doing that testing for your products to ensure that it meets the applicable federal requirements into the countries of which you are selling. And looking at the certification process of the three, there's a lot of overlap here. So basically the general process is we get your application, work with you through the on-site audit, and then work with you to resolve findings. So for the organic, that is called the Organic System Plan, or OSP. Every operation will have an on-site inspection, basically to verify that everything that's provided to us in this OSP packet is accurate and as described in the OSP and is sufficient to verify your segregation, your traceability, your contamination prevention procedures, your sanitation procedures, and all of your SOPs are as described and adequate to ensure compliance with the organic standard. And so after we do that on-site inspection, we are going to consolidate our findings into a report and make a certification decision. So there's kind of 3 possible certification decisions: certification, non-compliance, or denial. Denial is very rare. In most cases, we're seeing a positive certification result, or if we issue non-compliances, SCS will work with you through those. Non-compliances are resolvable. So these are things that need to be addressed before you can be certified. People view non-compliances as a very negative thing, but really they're just issues that we need to make sure are resolved. In almost all cases, they are resolvable. And then at renewal, we're going to have you submit any updates to your system, and we'll schedule the on-site inspection and go through the process again. And something to note is all 3 of these certifications do require annual renewals. Looking at the certification process for Non-GMO Project. Sorry, my mouse is not behaving today. Oh, okay. So for the Non-GMO Project, this is going to be a desk-based audit. So it's going to be mostly emails back and forth with the auditor, but we're going to really focus on an in-depth ingredient review here. So we'll look at your formulations, we'll classify your inputs and review them depending on the percentage they are in your product. So we'll break them down into different percentages that have different compliance requirements. We'll look at the risk level, if they're high risk versus low risk versus, there's a couple other risk levels in there as well. Do that facility review that includes segregation, traceability, and quality control. If you require an on-site inspection, again, very few operations do, but if an on-site inspection is required, we'll come and do that. And then, much like organic, we'll consolidate the inspection findings. They'll be explained to you in a report, and certification decision will result in certification, non-conformance, or denial. Non-conformances, much like non-compliances, can be resolved and usually are just things that need to be addressed before we can issue that certification. Renewal process looks pretty similar, submitting any updates and conducting your renewal desk audit and on-site if applicable. And for gluten-free, we'll start off by taking a look at your ingredients used in your product and provide a risk level to you. We'll do your facility review, just take a look at existing procedures already in place. This can be done before or during your inspection. So we'll do the on-site inspection if you have gluten and or high-risk ingredients like oats in your facility. Otherwise, you'll be eligible for a virtual inspection. After that, we'll review your testing requirements for you with ingredients, if applicable, finished good products, and equipment, if applicable. Consolidate all of your findings into a report, and you'll be able to work with your reviewer to resolve any non-compliances that are issued or things that need to be resolved before you can get that certification. And much like the other 2 certifications, renewal looks very similar. So we'll have you submit any updates, and then we'll conduct that virtual or on-site inspection. So just a few keys to success for each of the 3 and things that it's good to start thinking about if you're interested in any of the 3 certifications. For organic, definitely reach out and talk to a certifier. Come to us and tell us, that you want certification and the date by which you're hoping to achieve certification. This helps us help you plan and set expectations. If you're a farmer, letting us know your anticipated harvest date is really helpful, so we can kind of get a plan in place to get you certified in time. Review all of your pesticide and fertility inputs prior to use to ensure they are compliant with the standard. Start your record keeping really early. And one thing to note with pesticide and fertility inputs is there is a 3-year requirement. So you cannot use any prohibited substances on your land for 3 years prior to organic certification. So, let us know if the things that you've applied, and we'll walk you through the process and let you know if you are eligible for organic certification. Create really obvious and easily understood and followed segregation practices in your facility, and develop a good traceability system, because these are all going to be really important components of your organic audit. If you are making a formulated product, it must contain a minimum of 95% certified organic ingredients. This does exclude water and salt. And it's important to note that that remaining 5% cannot be anything. There's a very, very small and specific list of items that that remaining 5% can be comprised of. And if you're interested, I've put a little reference here to the USDA standard. It's 205.605 and 205.606 are the list of ingredients that are allowed to be used in a certified product. There are, of course, requirements around using these specific ingredients. So again, it can only come from one of these two lists, and there are additional requirements around them if they're not organic. So just keep that in mind. For Non-GMO Project, there we go. Using ingredients that are already Non-GMO Project verified is really helpful. So in organic, you kind of have to use, if you're a processor, you're required to use ingredients that are certified, where that is not necessarily required for Non-GMO Project. So if you're making a granola bar that maybe, I don't know, contains a dairy input, for example, or honey, let's look at honey. We're gonna have to be looking at the feed, any supplemental feed provided to the bees, as well as the forage area for that honey used to produce your granola bar. So that's going to involve cooperation and involvement from many steps of the supply chain. So sourcing a verified honey is going to make your life a lot easier. This is specifically true for ingredients that are subject to sampling and testing. So those are going to be those high-risk crops listed out from that previous slide. And then things, I think I went over the animal-derived inputs that we're actually looking at the feed provided to animals. So getting those types of ingredients especially verified will just make your life easier. But because we have to go up the supply chain for those more heavily processed or animal-derived ingredients, it tends to be a little bit easier to source verified. Know your supply chain and the agricultural sources of your ingredients. This is a big one because a lot of times what holds up certification the longest is getting all the necessary information for your example, natural flavor. So we have to go to you to collect information on the components of your natural flavor. And let's say it contains maybe an ethanol as a solvent. Well, from there, we have to get your flavor supplier to understand the agricultural source of that ethanol because we have to evaluate that for risk of genetic modification. So they might have to reach out to their ethanol supplier to gather information. So it can involve many steps in the supply chain. So understanding the agricultural sources and preferably using ones that are low risk will make your life easier when it comes to the evaluation process. In that vein, choosing suppliers who are cooperative, responsive, and willing to provide ingredient documentation is a huge help and key to success. Having flexibility in your formulations and or your ingredient suppliers, depending on the challenges that we face, can be helpful. Some agricultural inputs are higher risk than others and have more complex compliance pathways. So being able to be adaptable will make your life a bit easier when going through the verification process. And creating obvious and easily understood segregation and contamination practices is a key to success for all three of these certifications. And for gluten-free, if you're using high-risk ingredients like oats, picking things that are certified gluten-free, especially to standards that are the certification is less than 10 parts per million, like SCS Gluten-Free. So someone claiming a self-made gluten-free claim on their product might mean that they only have knowledge that their product is less than 20 parts per million, which is not sufficient. So we need that less than 10 parts per million. If it's already certified to a standard that's less than 10 parts per million, that will greatly reduce the testing requirements on your side of things. Again, knowing your supply chain and the agricultural sources of your ingredients. We need to know what all of these are before we can provide a risk level to your ingredients. So coming prepared with having that information before you get started. Again, creating obviously and easily understood segregation and contamination practices, and having a plan in place for preventing contamination of gluten, and one that's thoroughly described and written out either in your existing SOPs or as a separate SOP related to gluten contamination prevention, making sure you have thorough GMPs and SSOPs, and having a supplier approval program. So with that, I will hopefully be able to get us to the questions slide.
Lucy, I can take control back and get us there.
Thank you, Ned.
No problem. Awesome. So thank you so much, Lucy. That was wonderful. Really, really in depth and great overview of these important and different standards. Now we can do question and answer. We have some questions from the audience that I can read out and do with Lucy. Before then, if anybody needs to take off, my contact information is on the screen. You can reach me via phone or via email at your convenience if you have any follow-up questions. If you would like an application for any of these services, SCS can provide bundled service discounts. We can even provide the same auditor to take you through these audits simultaneously if that's desirable. So there's a lot of ways in which we can help companies get any of these certifications on a fast and transparent timeline. Also, we have another webinar coming up, which is called Responsible and Sustainable Sourcing Programs, Formalizing Your Supplier Expectations to Raise the Bar and Provide Transparency. That will be on August 10th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, let's get to the questions. First question is, what are the parameters for parts per million for gluten-free testing? Lucy, do you want to handle that one?
Sure, yeah. So our requirements for finished good product testing, and then as well as ingredients and or equipment, if required, are going to be 10 parts per million. And we require that testing is either done with an AOAC certified test kit in-house or is done by an ISO 17025 accredited lab. So 10 parts per million, I think, is the short answer to your question.
What about the frequency? Do you find that different facilities, different risk classifications can lead to different levels of testing frequency?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the classic example I always give is, you're looking at a facility that only produces, their one product they produce in the entire facility is a gluten-free banana nut muffin, and comparing that to a facility that produces a gluten-free banana nut muffin on the exact same equipment that they produce a gluten-containing banana nut muffin. So, it has the gluten-containing one maybe has a wheat flour in it, and the gluten-free one maybe has a gluten-free flour blend in it. There is a much higher risk for contamination in that facility that's not only handling wheat, but producing a similar product type. So the equipment, there will be equipment testing required in that facility that's producing both versions of the same product. There will be increased finished good product testing to assess these risks. And that's the type of operation that would also require an on-site inspection. And so we'll come in and make sure, have eyes on the ground, kind of looking at everything, assessing for any risk or spillover of ingredients. There's a higher potential that ingredients could potentially get mixed up or pulled. There's a higher potential that things could accidentally get mislabeled with the gluten-free logo if they are not gluten-free. So there's just a lot higher of risk, so that would necessitate higher testing requirements. And then I think I covered ingredients before, but it really just depends on the agricultural source of the ingredient that will dictate the testing. And oats tend to be one of the highest risk in terms of overlap in the supply chain with gluten-containing grains. So those will have a much higher level of ingredient testing required than something like raw fruit, for example, which is considered pretty low risk and has pretty minimal testing requirements.
Great, thank you. Could you please talk a little bit about the differences between GFCO gluten-free and SCS gluten-free?
Sure, absolutely. So I think probably the biggest difference is going to be that risk-based on-site inspection. So using the example of the facility that's only producing the gluten-free banana nut muffin or whatever that is, you're not handling any other gluten in the facility, you're not handling ingredients outside the scope of certification. That's relatively low risk. We're going to make sure you have all of the necessary procedures in place. We're going to make sure you're doing the adequate amount of testing. We're going to make sure you have, good GMPs in place and your employees aren't, for an example, eating a sandwich over the production line or something ridiculous like that. So we're still going to be doing that thorough evaluation, but we don't necessarily see the need to come and send someone on site. So that's going to save everyone time and money by allowing us to do these virtual inspections. And I think a big silver lining of COVID, I'll say, is that we've been able to really develop robust virtual inspection techniques. So we really feel like we can, in a lot of cases, assess the risk and make sure that we're seeing everything we need to see. So, you know, while it's a virtual inspection, it's not as risky, and we don't necessarily need someone to come in and look in every corner. We have pretty robust techniques for doing these virtual on-sites.
Yeah, while able to save the client a tremendous amount of time and money on travel fees for the auditor. So there's a lot of benefits to a virtual inspection, you know, beyond just the logistics. Okay, next question. Are you seeing any trends / forecasts for new types of certifications in the near future? I can answer this a little bit. The industry, I think, at large is going more towards sustainability certifications that specifically relate to carbon accounting, climate metrics of the supply chains and of the products that are being produced. So there's a lot of growth in terms of these standards. SCS offers climate neutral certifications and other you know, carbon accounting programs here. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with me about any of those. Other things like upcycled, which SCS does not offer yet, and plant-based are other standards that we see coming more and more online. The plant-based certification is something, you know, that we are developing. I can't give you a date as to when that will or won't be available, but that's another certification that we see happening more and more is the plant-based. Lucy, do you have any others?
I think that pretty much covers them. SCS is in the process of developing our own plant-based certification standard, so we look forward to offering that sometime in the near future.
Sure, great. How have recent supply chain issues put strain on or affected compliance and auditing processes? Great question.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think we've seen a lot of this, you know, given the war in Ukraine and some drought this year, especially with oilseed crops, that there have been supply chain issues, and we've been working with our clients to kind of develop, and our scheme owners as well, to kind of develop compliance pathways to make sure that you can still source the ingredients that you need to while, you know, ensuring that they maintain the integrity required by the standard. I think the Non-GMO Project has been doing a really good job of assessing risk and reaching out and figuring out ways that we can alleviate this burden from some of our clients, especially given canola is one of the crops that's been hit the hardest recently. So it's a dynamic challenge, absolutely. But I will say, you know, we generally so far have seen success in working with our clients to make sure that we're providing the resources that we can, and our scheme owners are working to further understand and create compliance pathways related to this.
Great. Next question, what happens if I have non-conformities? I think this could probably be applied to any of these three services.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think, so, you know, as I said before, people view these as big major issues, and really they're just things that we want you to work on to address. And a lot of the non-conformance or non-conformity, the resolution process is a root cause analysis and a preventative action. So basically it's just it's saying, how did this happen and how can we prevent it from happening again? And so these aren't, you know, necessarily life-ending problems or anything like that. They're just things that we want you to fix and get in better shape so that you are in compliance with the standard. They are almost always resolvable. And we will work with you to provide resources to help you resolve these issues. But really people view them as something scary, but I like to view them more as a learning opportunity.
Absolutely. If you are already certified organic processor, would there be any reason to also certify non-GMO?
Great question. Yeah, and so one of the differences I mentioned before, I think, is the Non-GMO Project does have that kind of post-harvest testing. So there are differences between these two standards. You know, with organic, you are required to grow crops from non-GMO seeds. You are required to have buffer zones in place to prevent, you know, cross-pollination and things like that. But with the Non-GMO Project, you're kind of adding that extra assurance of that really, really thorough ingredient review of GMOs, and with, you know, things that are on those specific lists of 605 and 606. while the USDA does require a non-GMO statement, the Non-GMO Project is going to be going levels back in the supply chain to ensure that they actually are non-GMO and meet the requirements of the standard.
And beyond that, there's an added marketing benefit to getting Non-GMO Project verified. Even if you are certified organic, it provides another marketing tool. It's another certification mark you can communicate to your buyers with. So there is the added benefit there as well. Next question, could a corn-derived product certified as, I think the question is, could a corn-derived product be certified non-GMO verified, polysorbate in specific used as ingredient? The raw material is not controlled, but the supplier said that because of the process, we could not find DNA proteins or modified DNA.
Okay, yeah, this is a really good question. So basically someone's asking if something is derived from corn and then processed, so there is no detectable DNA left, can it be Non-GMO Project verified? So what the Non-GMO Project is going to do is they actually go up the supply chain. So their goal is to prevent GMOs from the supply chain as opposed to just looking at the finished good product. So a good example of this is going to be a polysorbate. Even sugar sometimes is processed enough to remove detectable DNA. Things like corn syrup derived from corn are the hydrolyzation process does remove DNA, so it cannot be, you might test a corn syrup and find that there's no detectable GMO DNA in there and think, oh, well, this is non-GMO corn syrup. So what the Non-GMO Project does is they focus on the testing of precursors. So in the case of a corn syrup or a polysorbate, the Non-GMO Project requires that the corn used to produce that does have the intact DNA is tested. And so they really care about GMOs in the supply chain as opposed to GMOs in the finished good product. So if your polysorbate tests negative for GMOs, that is not really helpful information for Non-GMO Project verification. If the corn used to produce your polysorbate tests negative for GMOs, that means that that polysorbate would be eligible for Non-GMO Project verification. If the corn used to produce the polysorbate is in fact genetically modified, then that polysorbate produced from GMO corn will not be eligible for Non-GMO Project verification, regardless of if it has detectable DNA in it or not.
If a finished good contains a small amount of polysorbate, that polysorbate is derived from GMO corn, there is still a compliance pathway.
Yes, so the Non-GMO Project has very, very specific regulations on what they call an exemption. So depending on the type of ingredient and the percentage at which it is used, and then also depending on other ingredients in the product, there are eligibility pathways for what they call exemptions. So I think their kind of motto here is don't let the good become the enemy of the perfect. So if you're sourcing non-GMO crops and things like that, and your product is does not contain GMOs except for you have an additive in it that's maybe 0.1% of the finished good product, and we can't get that information from the supplier on the GMO status of that, then that is eligible for what the Non-GMO Project calls an exemption. Again, they're very small percentages. The cumulative total has a limit. Each individual component contributing towards that has a limit, and it's not eligible for anything. So it is a very strict requirement, but there are potential eligibility pathways, yes.
Great. Are there any certifications that speak to the protection of farm workers and/or indigenous land? Yes, there are many certification programs that address the social component of the standard, including worker rights and protections and safety. SCS's proprietary sustainably grown standard is one of those. I believe the SMETA program is also one of those. Fair trade also has some labor indicators as well. Lucy, can you think of any others?
Not off the top of my head, but that's a great start. Regenerative organic as well does have a social component.
Great. I'm not aware of any that specifically address indigenous land, but there may be. I'm not 100% certain. Can brand owners who do not do their own manufacturing get certified to these programs?
Absolutely. In all three cases, the answer is yes. So for organic, your contract manufacturer or co-packer will have to be organic certified themselves in order for you to be eligible to get that private label certification. That is not the case for Non-GMO Project and gluten-free. They can be verified or certified, but you can also handle that verification or certification on your end. In both cases, it will involve the co-packer. I would argue gluten-free a little bit more so than Non-GMO Project, but in both cases, we will need to do a full evaluation of the facility and make sure that they are operating in compliance, but they do not have to be the actual participant and the one receiving the certification or verification.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we see all the time with the Non-GMO Project. We work with many brand owners who do not do their own manufacturing, and we work in concert with the facility, getting the facility profile and traceability information, anything else we need to successfully verify these products. So especially with the Non-GMO Project and even with gluten-free, you do not need to do your own manufacturing in order to apply for these certifications, to receive the certificate itself. All of that can be done at the brand owner level. So please don't hesitate to reach out. That is going to conclude the question and answer section of the webinar. We're right at time here. It's 11 a.m. Pacific almost. So we will conclude this webinar. And thank you so much, Lucy. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely, happy to be here.
It's just been a great webinar so far. So please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is on screen. You will receive a copy of the recorded version of this webinar as well. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.